Welcome classic rock fans to my first video posting of 2020. I figured where better to start than one of my ranking videos. If you like this content and my reviews, please click like, subscribe and check that bell so you do get notified of any future uploads. For this video I'd like to do a ranking of Queen's albums worst to best. Of course this is purely my opinion, my personal preferences, and I'd certainly be interested in yours, so please leave your comments below. So coming in at number 15 for me, which probably comes as no surprise for a lot of Queen fans, is Hot Space from 1982. I think it's fair to say that most bands can have a disappointing album, and this is definitely Queen's. I think this is an album that is very misguided. It seems to be very much influenced by the sort of music Freddie was exposed to in many of the clubs he'd frequent. It's an incredibly inconsistent record in my opinion, saved by the Brian May compositions and of course the inclusion at the very last moment of the absolutely marvellous Under Pressure. But Hot Space delivers music that it certainly seems to belong to the genre of black disco, R&B. It's certainly a far cry from their usual sound, and you've got to remember in the early 80s for the rock crowd, if you like, disco was still very much seen as a pejorative at the time. I think it's fair to say that the guitar work on this album is very underplayed. It's as subdued as a vibrator under 6 feet of sand. In many ways the guitar is subordinate to the sort of synth textures the band wanted to explore for this record. To me, Hot Space sounds like a bit of cheesy sort of post-disco 1980s pop. It's redeemed slightly, as I've said before, by the Brian May compositions. One critic has already pointed out, and I have to concur fully, is that the song Body Language also sounds like a bit of a dry run for Billy Ocean's When the Going Gets Tough. And this album is certainly tough going. And number 14 is Made in Heaven from 1995. Now this album is invested with a lot of emotion, I think, from the audience and from the band as well, understandably so given the circumstances. But it's interesting now to sort of look back on it retrospectively and sort of think about it as an artistic whole. And admittedly, sort of Mercury's performances, his vocal performances, are absolutely incredible considering his health at the time. But that doesn't stop the album being fragmented and disjointed and inconsistent. It doesn't feel like an artistic whole or an artistic statement, which an album should be. It feels like a kind of a collection of curios, really, a sort of collection of B-sides and offcuts that bands often put together at the last minute or often release as to supplement something else. That's what it feels like to me. That's not to say there aren't occasional glimpses of absolute brilliance on this album. I think Heaven for Everyone, Winter's Tale, You Don't Fool Me, but the album does feel like a kind of an anthology of offcuts. I certainly understand that this album was probably almost a cathartic experience for the band, and maybe for the listener as well at the time, but it certainly falls short of their best material, and it seems like a band that have certainly run out of ideas at this point. And that last 20 minutes sort of instrumental at the end of the album certainly shows a band bereft of any creativity. Number 13 is Flash Gordon from 1980. Now I must admit I do like some of the instrumentals on this record, and I do like the film, but then I've got a thing for sort of camp sci-fi in many respects. I have to fess up to that. I think Queen are ideally suited to make music for a film of this type with their sense of showmanship and theatricality, and they do a fine job, it has to be said. Of course, this album is almost entirely instrumental, which is no doubt what we'd expect from a soundtrack, apart from, of course, Flash's theme and The Hero, of course, which had lyrics. Although, to be honest with you, I'm not a huge fan of soundtrack albums. They tend to be right bitty and sort of fragmented. They're served up to accompany the main event rather than being the main event in themselves. So I generally do not like sort of soundtrack albums, to be honest with you. In many ways this album is of its time, I think, and as is the film, of course. Those sort of synth textures explored on it are very much incumbent upon that burgeoning sort of minimalistic electronic sound that was emerging in the early 1980s. But nevertheless, I'm not convinced it works particularly well for Queen. Freddie meets Vangelis. Anyway, the Flash Gordon soundtrack comes in at number 13. And number 12 is A Kind of Magic from 1986. This album for me has very much a soundtrack vibe to it, probably due to the fact that 6 of the songs on this record are for the Highlander Project or accompany the Highlander Project. Those songs are set against, it's a Kind of Magic and Friends Will Be Friends and One Vision, which are great standalone songs. But a lot of the songs are sort of peppered with sort of references to The Prize and Eternity, which seems to make this album feel very much of the sort of Highlander project in many respects. It does sound very dated to me, but then a lot of 1980s albums do. I'm not a big fan of those 1980s sort of affectations and production values. I've made that very clear in my previous videos, and this album suffers a little bit for that. I mean, but there's no doubt the band were riding high for this album from after their stratospheric performance on Live Aid, which saw them projected straight into sort of almost rock royalty, if you excuse the pun. But nevertheless, I find it difficult to see this album as an individual sort of artistic statement rather than something that accompanies Highlander. It feels like a kind of a soundtrack masquerading as an album in its own right, a sort of soundtrack that's passed over the counter in sort of a hushed brown paper bag. So number 12 for me is A Kind of Magic from 1986. Number 11 is The Miracle from 1989. This album doesn't lack ambition. It's an album that brings together sort of a hybrid of styles, but nevertheless it doesn't really work for me in many respects. The title of the album is actually going to be The Invisible Men, and it feels like a bit of an invisible album for me. Of course you get I Want It All on this, which is absolutely fabulous, and you get the experiments with sort of electro-funk with Invisible Man. But the album is swathed in sort of synth textures, which I find a little bit irksome. It's certainly salvaged by Freddie Mercury's fantastic sort of vocal performance. I mean, I have to say the instrumentation on this record is absolutely brilliant, credit where credit's due. But for me, it's the balance of styles that just does not feel natural. It seems unfocused and just doesn't seem to work. I'm constantly listening to this album, wondering whether sort of coup de grace is the money shot. It just seems very unsatisfying. As regards this album, I'm going to leave you with a quote from NME. And of course, we all know what a huge fan of Queen NME were. I quote, "Queen are coasting now, ripping off Ray Parker Jr.'s Ghostbusters on The Invisible Man and Don Henley's The Boys of Summer on Breakthrough. I Want It All is boisterous enough, but too ordinary for this lot." Anyway, time for a short break for me. I'm going to have a coffee and then come back with my Queen Top 10 ranking, so stay tuned for that. And number 10 is The Game from 1980. Certainly the band are looking to new horizons with this album, and part of me feels that we've kind of been lubed up in preparation for the calamity that is Hot Space. But I think the difference with this record is that the funk elements to it provide an undercurrent to the sort of main sort of Queen sound, rather than being the presiding motivating principle that it becomes on Hot Space. We certainly get some landmark numbers on this one. Another one, Bites the Dust, of course, which I believe is a John Deacon penned number. If I'm not mistaken, if I am, I do apologise. Save Me, which is one of my favourite Queen songs of all time. And obviously Dragon Attack is a great one as well, and I think it's a song that the current incarnation of Queen drag out live, and fair play to them for that. Many have gone on to describe The Game as kind of a glossy, unabashed sort of pop album. Certainly a lot of the bombast and strings and sort of, shall we say, sort of progressive elements that defines much of their 70s material is certainly gone by the time we get this album. I always think this album as the bridge between the sort of 70s Queen and the more synth-laden sort of Queen we got in the 1980s. But certainly the sound on this album is much starker. There are songs on this album that have a kind of almost sort of rock, disco, sort of funk blending to them. Another one, Bites the Dust, would be a prime example of that, of course. And you get those wonderful sort of power ballads, Play the Game and Save Me. And when I say power ballad, I don't mean that as a pejorative, all the sort of hands in the air, sort of lighters, all that sort of shit. I mean, it's very powerful songs that generally wrench at your very soul. There's certainly a lot on this album to recommend it, but I see this as a record that is kind of preparing us for ushering us into a new period for this band. Number 9 is Innuendo from 1991. It's a wonderful album in many respects, full of sort of humour and pathos. I even love the number Delilah to Freddie Mercury's Cat. It's also a record that employs the sort of guitar noodlings of Steve Howe, and being a big Yes fan, that's definitely got to recommend it to me. And The Show Must Go On is a fabulous number, of course, a number penned by Brian May, if I'm not mistaken. A song that deals very much with Freddie Mercury's struggles at the time. But a lot of this album is very much about looking inwards. It's quite introspective in that respect. Of course, this is the record that gives us the devastatingly beautiful These Are the Days of Our Lives. We all remember the video, of course, with the heartbreakingly frail Freddie in it. It seems to me on this album the band are trying to deal with that sense of despair and hopelessness given Freddie's situation. and they try to deal with that by creating the best music they possibly can, and we get that seismic shudder that is the title track, Innuendo. How devastatingly awesome is that? And it's a real hark back to sort of 1970s Queen. There's no doubt in my mind that this album has some genuinely breathtaking moments on it. And number 8 is The Works from 1984, an album that sees the band really rediscover its rock roots. It ticks all the boxes and genuinely works, no pun intended. And of course this album really hits home with Hammer to Fall, which is a fabulous sort of crunching number. I Want to Break Free, of course, which is a perfect slice of sort of mid-80s pop. Now I remember seeing the video of this on Swap Shop. They were showing the videos to their guests on that morning, and the guest was obviously passed judgment on the latest releases. I remember the politician Cyril Smith was there, and he said of I Want to Break Free that he didn't like it because he didn't really like to see men dressed as women. It's a pity he wasn't equally disapproving of men diddling young boys. Certainly this album is a real statement of intent, and they emerged triumphant after Hot Space, of course. I think NME has said of the song Hammer to Fall, if I may quote, Hammer to Fall, it's a song that offers their most trouser-tightening riff in 7 years. And to me that's the key to the greatness of this album. It has a bit of edge to it. It has what Lawrence Delalio would describe as a bit of dog. It's a real sort of bite to it and power. Of course, Radio Gaga was an immensely beautiful song as well. It has a mournful quality to it, and is another one of those Queen numbers which is absolutely devastating live. But there are other great songs on here as well, including Hard Life, Tear It Up, Man on the Prowl. Lots of really, really good songs on here that often translate beautifully live and establish Queen as perhaps one of the best live acts of the time. Number 7 is Jazz from 1978, an album that's described as quite idiosyncratic in many respects. But for me, Queen have always experimented sort of with musical form and sort of pastiche, from the wonderful sort of Noel Coward homages that they've often done to that wonderful D-sus-4 rockabilly pastiche or crazy little thing called Love. There's no doubt about it that jazz offers some exquisite moments of Queenness, which in many respects is very much a testimony to the band's versatility, from the sort of Middle Eastern feel of Mustafa, which is not just a reworking of Hernando's Hideaway, which is what Rolling Stone magazine said about it all those years ago. Yet Fat Bottom Girls, which feels a bit like a macho piss take in many respects, but is a great stomping number. And of course the glorious Bicycle Race with its glorious sort of pop culture references. For the record, I do love Star Wars, by the way. Then you get the Don't Stop Me Now, which sounds like a kind of an amped up Cole Porter number, to the Dreamer's Ball, which is very theatrical and has sort of music hall pretensions, all contributing to that soup of high camp theatrical affectations that Queen do so well. For me, this reflects the fact that Queen were masters of what could be achieved within the sort of paradigms of sort of rock music. Of course, it was hated by Rolling Stone magazine. Rolling Stone magazine described it as, for my quote, just more of the same dull pastiche that's dominated all of Queen's work. But I don't agree. I think this, in many respects, is what gives them their sort of vibrancy and sort of uniqueness. As I've said, I love the sort of different moods and atmospheres explored on this album. There were wonderful moments of heaviness, of course, with sort of multi-layered guitars, which just sound absolutely brilliant. And Freddie, of course, infuses this album with a sense of the absurd and is absolutely intoxicating. I think Fat Bottom Girls is a song that stands out as being a highlight for me, that wonderful tale of prepubescent corruption at the hands of a naughty nanny, no doubt lifted straight from that cinematic classic Carry On Freddie. A great song dedicated to girls with that little bit extra, shall we say. Also Bicycle Race. I never tire of watching that video, but for me it's that example of that sense of stratospheric exaggeration which defined Queen. And of course the original vinyl came with that wonderful poster, if you remember. No doubt a poster that had Jermaine Greer frothing at the gills. Number 6 is Queen, the debut album from 1973. This is where it all starts, of course. I love the production on this album. I love the sound on this album. The sound of Brian May's homemade guitar. It's almost as if the band cannot be restrained by the slab of vinyl on which this music was presented. It's constantly heaving against its restraints and threatens to burst out and go rampaging through the collective unconscious like some bestudded glam rock behemoth. There's no doubt it's a powerful, multifaceted record, with absolute sublime performances. Keep Yourself Alive, of course, stands out, described as one critic as being, if I may refer to my notes, as both breathless and languid. Of course, you get Great King Rap, Son and Daughter, and Liar. I mean, how awesome is that? But more importantly, it showcases at the very beginning those sort of musical motifs and theatrical qualities that would come to define the band. My Fairy King and Rhye embody that sort of bombacity, theatricality, and numerous other adjectives you could throw at this band. At the very beginning, they seem to be encompassing a form of glam rock that hovers tantalisingly close to being progressive. Progressive, of course, without being sort of too noodly and too intellectual. Numbers like Son and Daughter and Good Time Rock and Roll are quite incendiary numbers in many respects that sit quite comfortably next to that melancholic ache of doing all right. I mean, the band gallop along on this record like the bastard progeny of Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, all sort of merged into one. Number 5 is Day at the Races from 1976, viewed as many to be the kind of the poor relative of Night at the Opera, and I do have some sympathy with that viewpoint. I don't think it's as good. Nevertheless, it explores some interesting tones and atmospheres, from the crunching opening of Tie Your Mother Down, the glorious sort of gospel harmonies of Somebody to Love, of course, and one of my favourite tracks on this album is Good Old Fashioned Loverboy. It's a Noel Coward homage. One critic has described it as a tongue-in-cheek ragtime ditty exuding an almost pre-war sexual frisson. I think what distinguishes this album from its predecessors, in my opinion, is it's less progressive, but it does adhere to more sort of a conventional sort of song structures and form. It's almost as if they sort of steer away from a lot of the bombast we got on the previous record. And I don't mean that as a pejorative in any way. It was absolutely what gloriously defines the previous record. To something perhaps more conventional. I mean, I hate to use that adjective conventional associated with Queen. It just doesn't seem to fit. It just seems so wrong. But nevertheless, it's, it is equally brilliant in many respects. It has some wonderful, wonderful moments on it. I think one critic has said, one critic gave the album a mixed review, writing, "With A Day at the Races, they've deserted art rock entirely. They're silly now, and wondrously shameless." A whole range of emotions are explored on this album, from the explosive opening Tie Your Mother Down to the very melancholic You Take My Breath Away. In terms of mood, it's an album of contrasts, of course, but all great albums are. But for many, they see this album as a disappointing follow-up to Night at the Opera that was, at the time, still resonating across suburbia and Bohemia with equal measure. Number 4 is News of the World from 1977, an album, of course, that boasts cuts like We Are the Champions and We Will Rock You, songs that are very much instrumental in knitting together the very social fabric that surrounds us. However, to reduce this album to just those 2 songs would be doing a terrible disservice, I think. It's got some wonderful tracks on it, from Sheer Heart Attack, Spread Your Wings, Get Down, Make Love, and of course All Dead, All Dead, which is a song very much about the demise of Brian May's pussy. Nevertheless, there's no doubt about it, the band was certainly firing on all cylinders for this one. For many, News of the World was seen as a kind of a departure from that sonic panache which defined the previous 2 albums. It certainly seems less layered and starker, in my opinion. I don't know if that was a kind of a band responding to the whole punk thing that was going on at the time. Nevertheless, one critic has described it as an explosion in styles, but it's certainly less operatic. The songs on the album certainly seem more conventional, that word again, as the band seemed to kind of chant away their sort of progressive demons with the wonderful anthemic We Will Rock You, which has become kind of a manifesto for a generation. You also get that straight for the jugular urgency with Sheer Heart Attack and the grinding lasciviousness of Get Down, Make Love. David Marsh said in his review for Rolling Stone magazine in 1977, if I may quote, "They have managed to borrow all that's frothiest from their influences, from the fake orgasmic vocal contortions of Robert Plant to the semi-vaudevillian pop of the Beach Boys and the Beatles." Number 3 is Queen 2 from 1974. This has been described as Queen's heaviest album. You get Ogre Battle sort of blazing along, and I think in March the Black Queen, I think that's on this one, which gives the proggers something to get their teeth into. But nevertheless, this album embodies that sort of spirit of adventurism, which I just love about Queen. I think it's more than just that kind of difficult second album, but it is very much a very ambitious artistic manifesto of what was to come. Queen 2 follows a similar formula to the debut album, with its hard rocking numbers, sort of theatrical fantasy numbers and ballads, of course. But what distinguishes it from its predecessor is its glorious weirdness. and of course its tone, which is markedly darker, of course. It's a very ambitious record of all its kings, queens and fabled beasties that populated. It's a great album, a very ambitious album, which drifting towards a sort of intellectual noodling that is progressive rock. It still has at the very heart of it a thoroughly good rock album. The vocals, of course, are absolutely exquisite on this album, which is no doubt what we've come to expect from Queen. But they don't in any way overshadow the brilliance of the sort of guitar work on this album, or the wonderful sort of rhythm section, of course. It's an album that serves up huge dollops of magnificence, majesty and menace in equal measure. Number 2, Night at the Opera from 1975, finally the album with Bohemian Rhapsody on it. The song that nobody in their right mind should cover, in my opinion. Although Bad News did, of course. In fact, I remember seeing Bad News play this song at the Reading Festival in 1987. There's no doubt about it, Queen, with this album, produced a record that was going to be discussed for generations, from the vitriolic Death on Two Legs to the glorious Sweet Lady to the rhapsodic, no pun intended, I'm in Love with My Car. We tap along with anthemic numbers like You're My Best Friend, as well as the high camp of Seaside Rendezvous and Lazing on a Sunday Afternoon. This album has been described by Ultimate Classic Rock as the moment where pretension, ego and self-deprecation collide perfectly. It was also said to be the most expensive album ever made at the time of its release. I guess some things are just worth it. There's no doubt Queen was sort of pushing and stretching away at the boundaries of what was possible at the time, ultimately producing an album that many see as diverse. Many have accused it of being overblown and ridiculous, but ultimately a classic album nevertheless. The way this album is put together is absolutely masterful, and Queen were expert sequencing tracks for sort of maximum effect. I don't think it's as masterful as Sgt. Pepper, for example, or Pet Sounds for that matter, but you've got to remember these guys only had 4 tracks to work with. This album, of course, exudes the sort of trademark Queen sound, from the multi-layered guitars to the exquisite vocal performance by Freddie Mercury. It also boasts the Prophet song, which is one of my favourite songs, and that wonderful sort of orgasmic, some might say pseudo-operatic sort of performance that is Bohemian Rhapsody. This is no doubt one of the sort of unique albums of the 1970s. I mean, we think about some of the songs on this album, apart from the ones I've just listed, of course. Lazing on a Sunday Afternoon is an excellent sort of vaudevillian pastiche. Good Company, Brian May's homage to New Orleans. And Seaside Rendezvous, of course, with its great kazoo solo. I mean, how often do you get to say that within the paradigms of rock music? But it's wonderful as Freddie sort of recreates those sort of old-time musical japes. I almost feel as if I could see myself to this one promenading along the seafront with the two Ronnies. This album is a wonderful oral collage, from the soulful You're My Best Friend to the score-settling riff of Death on Two Legs to the pre-epic cock-jostling of I'm in Love with My Car to the beautiful sort of Prophet song. And of course Bohemian Rhapsody. You know, the inclusion of this song makes this album deservedly anybody's number 1, but of course it's not mine. And finally, of course, we get number 1, which is Sheer Heart Attack from 1974. Queen's third album is absolute perfection as far as I'm concerned. We see the band experimenting sort of with musical form, moving away from a lot of the fairy tale whimsy which defines the first 2 albums to produce a masterpiece of musical husbandry and splendour. It's not excessive, but it's not stark either. It's just perfect. Those sort of progressive and metal aspects of their music had already been well and truly forged, but with this record we get added emphasis upon drama, theatricality, arrangement, sort of gorgeous harmonies, outstanding musicianship, if you like. You could say that on this record the band's sort of modus operandi is well and truly established. Certainly this album isn't as symphonic as their later records, but it would certainly benefit from what classic rock describes as light and dark passages, dramatic heights and reflective interludes. Wonderful tracks on this album, from like Dear Friend, Lily of the Valley, that wonderful sort of ragtime feel of Bring Back That Leroy Brown, to the sort of Caribbean tones of Misfire. A very eclectic album indeed. Queen nail it on this record with soundscapes dense in harmonies and enigmatic sort of melodies, and the wonderful stereo phasing of Brighton rock which flip-flops between each speaker. That would certainly never become annoying, would it? And of course you get the very chorus-heavy Lap of the Gods Revisited, which is a wonderful anthemic number which almost anticipates the stadium rock Queen would eventually become. It's a song that is very satisfying to listen to. Of course, NME said of this album, and I'm quoting, Killer Queen, so perfect in length, shape and vamping girth, or Now I'm Here, with a years ahead new wave judder and pustules of guitar bursting through. In the Lap of the Gods is a pocket-sized epic delivering dire warnings of future excess. And as for She Makes Me, stormtrooping stilettos, have Roger Taylor's snares ever sounded so splashy? This album, as far as I'm concerned, propelled the band from being a mere opening act to a headlining stadium filler. And there you have it, my number one Queen album of all time is Sheer Heart Attack from 1974. There's no doubt about it, Queen had a very unique sound and presence, the like of which we'll never see again. And when Freddie Mercury sadly died in late 1991, I think it was very much the end of an aura. Anyway, you've been watching Classic Album Review, a worst to best ranking video. Please click like, subscribe, click that bell so you get notified of any future uploads. Check out the Facebook page, check out the Twitter page. I must tweet more often. But most of all, please do keep listening.